Hello everyone, and welcome to the Zen Guide channel. In this video, I will share a story whose author remains unknown. It is believed that this story possesses a magical power and has the potential to change the lives of those who listen to it. The story is divided into two parts. In the first part, I will first narrate the origin of this story, and in the second part, I will delve into the story itself. Enjoy watching and listening. I was sitting alone in the cafe, reaching for sugar to add to my coffee. The weather outside was dreadful. Snow was falling in wet, swirling gusts, and the wind was howling fiercely. Unwanted drafts of air penetrated the room every time the front door opened, reaching even the farthest corner. Nevertheless, I felt comfortable. Snow, wetness, and wind meant nothing to me as I was in a place where they couldn't affect me. As I daydreamed and sipped my coffee, the door opened and closed, and Edward walked in. Edward was an undeniable failure, but he was also a painter with above-average talent. Despite his artistic abilities, he had fallen into a vicious cycle of incompetence, despair, and bankruptcy. When I looked into Edward's eyes, I was somewhat surprised by the change in his appearance. He hadn't dressed differently. He was wearing the same worn-out coat and the old brown hat as always. Yet, there was something new and strange about his appearance. There was a different quality in his gestures as he shook his hat to rid it of the snow gathered on the black fur lining. When our eyes met, I noticed a change in him. Edward was my mascot. Dalmatian, bulldog, or terrier? I asked jokingly. After a long pause, he lifted his coffee cup to his lips and replied, "John. Have you lost a rich uncle?" I inquired. "No," he calmly responded. But finally, I found my opening. Dalmatian, bulldog, or terrier? I asked again. After a long time, he looked up and said, "John." "You're surprising me," I said. "Tell me the story." "I would like to hear it." Edward wanted to tell it. He was determined to share it with the whole world. "This morning I was a hopeless piece of trash in the city dump, starving and aimless. Tonight, I've switched places with a millionaire. It sounds absurd, but it's true. He has spent his fortune, and mine is intact." Taking a sip from his absinthe, I asked, "Are you surprising me?" "I know I am," he said. "I realize I'm surprising myself. I'm a new man, a different man, and the change happened in the last few hours. Most of the time, when you saw me entering here without a penny, you would turn away, pretending not to see me. I knew why you did that, not because you didn't want to pay for a meal, but because I didn't have the money to do so. The bill for this meal, is it? Can I handle it? I don't have any money tonight, but it's on me." He called the waiter and, with a quiet sparkle, signed the back of both bills. "And write these bills under my name," he said, sending the waiter away. After a moment of silence, he looked at me, smiling at the bewilderment I was unsuccessfully trying to conceal. "Do you know of a better painter than me?" he asked. "Do you know of anything I failed to achieve when I put my mind to it?" "No. You've been a reporter for daily newspapers for 8 years. Do you remember ever having any credit until tonight?" No. Am I rejected now? You've seen it with your own eyes. Tomorrow, a new career begins for me. I'll have a new bank account within a month. Why? I asked. Because I've discovered the secret of success. My luck has turned. I've been reading a strange story for a while, and since I read it, I've felt my luck change strangely. I'll give you that story too, and it will change your luck. You can't imagine what it can do for you. After reading it, nothing is impossible. It simplifies everything as much as ABC. Once you grasp its real meaning, success becomes certain. I was dying of hunger in the city dump this morning, with no credit and nowhere to eat. I was seriously considering suicide. I had gone to the newspapers where I used to work, and they had returned everything I had given them. I had to quickly decide between dying by suicide or slowly dying of hunger. Then I found and read the story. You can't imagine the transformation, everything changed in an instant, and here are the results. But what is the story, Edward? Wait, let me finish my words first. I took those old drawings to other editors, and they were all accepted at once. Can the story do for others what it did for you? For example, would it benefit me? Would it benefit you? He asked. Why not? I'll tell you the story. I'll do my best to explain it as well as I can. The story goes like this. Just then, the waiter interrupted, telling Edward he had a phone call, and the painter apologized and left the table. 5 minutes later, I saw him disappear into the wetness and wind, between the swirling gusts. As far as regulars in the cafe could remember, Edward had never been asked for on the phone before. This alone was significant evidence of the change in his circumstances. One night on the street, I ran into Ed, an old college friend who had later become a reporter for one of the evening newspapers. About a month had passed since the memorable meeting with Edward, which I had almost forgotten. "Hello, old friend," he said. "How is the world using you? Still in limbo?" "Yes," I replied, painfully. "I'm hoping to get some help soon. But you seem to be doing well. Tell me about it." "I am," he said. "I've recently started working as a reporter for the evening papers. I've been to the old newspapers where I used to work, and they've returned everything I gave them. Suicide or slow starvation. I had to decide quickly. Then I found and read the story. You can't imagine the transformation, everything changed in an instant, and here are the results. But what is the story, Edward? Wait, let me finish my words first. I took those old drawings to other editors, and they were all accepted at once. Can the story do for others what it did for you? For example, would it benefit me? Would it benefit you? He asked. Why not? I'll tell you the story. I'll do my best to explain it as well as I can. The story goes like this. At that moment, the waiter intervened, informing Edward that he had a phone call, and the painter apologized before getting up from the table. 5 minutes later, I saw him disappear into the wetness and wind, fading from view. As far as the regulars in the cafe could remember, Edward had never been called on the phone before. This alone was substantial evidence of a significant change in his circumstances. One night on the street, I ran into an old college friend who had later become a reporter for one of the evening newspapers. About a month had passed since the memorable meeting with Edward, which I had almost forgotten. "Hello, old friend," he said. "How is the world using you? Still in limbo?" "Yes," I replied, painfully. "I'm hoping to get some help soon. But you seem to be doing well. Tell me about it." "Well, things are going well, and it's quite fascinating when you hear the whole story. Do you know Edward? Everything happened because of him. My luck was completely going downhill. I was contemplating death and similar things. When I met Edward, I was actually calling you to see if you could lend me enough to cover my room rent." He told me a story, and really, my old friend, it was the most interesting story I've heard in my life. It made me a new man. Within 24 hours, I could stand on my own feet, and since then, I don't know what trouble or problem is. These words, spoken with the composure of a person stating a known truth, approached me, reminding me of the conversation I had with Edward in the cafe that stormy night a month ago. "It must be an interesting story," I said, disbelievingly. Once Edward had mentioned him to me. I haven't seen him since. Where is he now? He's in Cuba, sketching war scenes, earning $200 a week. He just returned. Since the story worked, it's a known fact for everyone. My friends, Coscaroo and Phillips, for example. You don't know them. One is a real estate agent, the other is a commission clerk. Edward told them the story, and they got the same results as me. And not just them. Do you know the story? I asked, will you try its effect on me? Absolutely, I would do it with the greatest pleasure. I want to print it in bold black letters and hang it in all the railway bridge stations in New York. It will definitely be very effective. And as simple as A, B, C. Can you give me a minute? I saw Danford over there. I'll be back in a minute, my old friend. To be honest, I'm broke. I had only 5 cents in my pocket at that moment. It could cover my fare to get out of downtown, but it wasn't enough to feed myself. I had a street food vendor I used to go to frequently for midnight snacks, and I went to him. Just as I was about to leave, the vendor was coming out of the car, and I approached him. I'm broke again, I said with great sincerity. You'll have to trust me once again, a bit of ham and eggs will do for now, I guess. He coughed, paused for a moment, and then got back into the car with me. To the attendant, he said, Mr. Courier is reliable about what he orders. He is one of my old customers. This is Mr. Bryan. He will take good care of you and support you just like I did. In fact, I've sold everything, transferred my property to Bryan. By the way, isn't Mr. Edward your friend? I nodded. Even if I wanted to, I couldn't speak. Yes, he continued. The former night owl. He came here about a month ago and told me the most fantastic story I've ever heard to this day. I recently got a place on 8th Avenue. I'll be running a stable restaurant there, near 23rd Street. Come and visit me. He had stepped out of the car by now, and the sliding door closed with a loud noise before I could stop him. I quietly ate my ham and eggs and decided to listen to this story before going to sleep. In fact, I had started to see this story as a myth. If it had worked so well for him, it must work for me too. The marvelous story had become, in my mind, a kind of enchantment, a magic. I was convinced it floated in the air, a certainty that permeated my entire being. Walking towards home, playing with the only metal coin in my pocket, and planning to descend into the city in the morning, I felt like fate was walking behind me, silently following me, unable to catch up. I was now aware that the story had taken hold of me. When I reached Union Square, I searched for Edward's address in my address book, but it wasn't listed. Then, I remembered the cafe in University Square and thought he might still be there, even though it was late. He was there, in a distant corner of the room, surrounded by a group of acquaintances. He noticed me at the same time, gesturing for me to join them at the table. However, there was no chance for the story. There were about half a dozen people around the table, and I was the farthest from Edward. Nevertheless, I kept my eyes on him and, when he got up to leave, I waited for the right moment to go with him. When I took my seat, a respectful hush with a hint of fear fell over the group. Everyone seemed to be deep in thought, and all eyes were on Edward. Why was he in the spotlight, telling the story? I had arrived at the cafe too late to listen to the story. When I sat down, there was a doctor on my right and a lawyer on my left. On the other side of the table, opposite me, there was a businessman I vaguely knew. The others were painters and journalists. "Very unfortunate, Mr. Courier," said the doctor. "You should have come a little earlier. Edward was telling us a story. Truly amazing." "Edward, wouldn't you retell the story for Mr. Courier?" "Of course. Although, I believe he was the first one I mentioned the story to, somehow he couldn't hear it. He was here in this cafe at this very table that stormy night. Do you remember how stormy that night was, Courier? I was called on the phone that night, or something like that, wasn't I?" "Of course, now I remember," he said. They had interrupted me just as I was about to start the story. After that, I told the story to 3 or 4 people, and the story strengthened in them just like it did in me. It seemed incredible that a mere story could have such a transformative effect on individuals with such diverse occupations. But it did. From curing a rapidly progressing tuberculosis to a severe cold, it worked on everything. It was like a cough syrup that guaranteed to treat anything. A medicine that never failed. For example, there was Parsons, you know, a commission clerk. He had been on the wrong side of the market for a month. He had completely lost control and was on the brink of failure. I met him when he felt the worst, and before leaving, something led me to the story, and I told him the story. As far as I know, it had the same effect on him as it did on everyone who heard the story. I think in the minds of those who know the story, it's not the story itself that works like a surgical operation, but the way it is told. It's like the written form of the story. The author somehow created an inexplicable psychological effect. The reader gets hypnotized, takes a mental and moral tonic. Perhaps, Doctor, you can provide us with a scientific explanation of the effect of the story. Isn't it like a kind of elixir produced from these words? The group then began a general discussion of theories. Occasionally, there were small references to the story, enough to disappoint me, the only one who hadn't listened to the story there. Finally, I got up from the chair, and by circling the table, I managed to grab Edward by one arm, pulling him away from the group. If you think about a mad old friend who has gone crazy due to the existence of this damn story, you will tell me about it now, I said viciously. Edward looked at me with great astonishment. Okay, he said. They will probably give me a few minutes. Sit down and let me tell you. I found an old album that I had bought from ENN Street for 3 cents, stuck with a glued-in form, and first started reading it without knowing which publication it appeared in or who wrote it. When I discovered it, I started reading it carelessly, and it immediately caught my interest. I must have joyfully walked a few miles without realizing that I was the same man who had been in deep despair just a short time ago when I met you here that day. Do you remember? Just then, a uniformed courier delivering a telegram to Edward intervened. The message was from the chief, and he needed to come to the office immediately. The dispatch was already an hour late, and there was nothing to be done. He had to leave as soon as possible. Very bad, he said, reaching out to shake hands as he stood up. Let me tell you what I'll do, my old friend. Take my key and wait for me in my room. You'll find an old album with a raw leather cover on the writing desk next to the window. I'm sure the author of this cover made it magical. Wait for me in my room until I return. Finding the notebook wasn't difficult. It was a peculiar, homemade item, just as Edward had described it, bound in raw leather with leather straps. The pages were made of yellowed paper scraps and peculiar homemade parchments. I found the oddly printed story on the last material written. It was strange and peculiar. It was evident that the printer had prepared it under the supervision of the writer. The expression style was an unusual composition of 17th and 18th century styles, and the addition of italics and bold letters to the text could only have come from the mind of the author. Here is the unknown magical stories writer. Due to my experiences, from which I have extracted one of the great secrets of worldly affairs, I believe it would be wise, with my numbered days left, to give future generations the opportunity to benefit from the knowledge I possess. I do not apologize for my expression style or literary value, as I know the latter is its own apology. I have always been burdened with heavier tools than the pen, and the weight of the years has somehow paralyzed my hand and mind. Still, I can convey to you the truth that I see as the kernel. What does it matter how the shell is cracked to obtain and make it useful? I am confident that, if I narrate my life story, the instructions for gathering the materials and adding the spices for the success of the meal will be clearly understood. These could be, and generations after I have become part of the earth, people grateful for what I have written may come into the world. Back then, my father, a seafarer who settled on a farm in the Virginia colony where I was born in 1642. If he had heeded the wise advice to continue my mother's education, it would have been better for my father. However, he did not, and the good ship he captained had been traded for the land I mentioned. When I turned 10, my mother passed away, and 2 years later, dear father followed her. I, their only child, was left alone. Nevertheless, I had 2 friends who took care of me for a while. So they opened a nest for me under their roof. I benefited from this for 5 months. I had nothing left from my father's estate, but in the following years, when my mind was sound, I became sure that my friend, with whom I had sheltered for a while, had eaten my father's and, therefore, my rightful share. I won't tell anything about the time from the age of 12.5 to 23 because that period has no connection with this story. However, after a while, I boarded a ship bound for Boston with 16 guineas out of the earnings I accumulated from my works and started working there first as a cooper and then as a ship carpenter since the sea was not among my aspirations. Fate, sometimes due to a completely wayward temperament, deliberately smiles at a certain victim. I also had such an experience. I became rich, and by the time I reached the age of 27, I was the owner of the business where I had worked as a hired hand for less than 4 years. However, luck is a volatile woman that needs to be forcibly confined, and she doesn't pay much attention. During this time, a disaster, which can be considered the harbinger of weak spirits and lost intentions, visited me. A fire destroyed my business and left me with debts I couldn't afford, alone on dark roads. In search of help for a new beginning, I worked with acquaintances. But it seemed that the fire that burned my house also consumed their sympathy. Thus, in a short time, not only did I lose everything, but I also hopelessly owed others and, therefore, ended up in jail. Apart from this last inappropriate behavior that completely made me desperate, I could have recovered from my losses. I stayed in prison for a year, and when I finally got out, I was no longer a hopeful man who trusted the world and people. There are many paths in life, and the vast majority of them lead downward. Some are very winding, some are less steep. But in the end, no matter what angle they slope, they all reach the same place: failure. When I got out of prison, I had no 5 cents. I had nothing but poor clothes on me and a cane, which the guard allowed me to keep because it was worthless. Still, as a skilled worker, I quickly found well-paying jobs. However, I couldn't rid myself of dissatisfaction as someone who had tasted the fruit of the world, became gloomy and melancholic. Therefore, to cheer up and forget my losses, I spent my evenings in the tavern. Not because I drank much, except occasionally, as I have always been a bit abstinent, but to laugh, have fun, sing, and joke with my friends who couldn't do anything. I enjoyed telling the story of my disaster when I was a bit tipsy and cursing those I thought did me wrong by not coming to my aid. I also took childish pleasure in stealing a few minutes from my employer, who paid me every day. Such behavior is even less honest than open theft. This habit continued and intensified until the day I found myself not only unemployed but also without character. That's when I saw myself as a mistake. I can think of my situation at that time as the condition of a man slipping down the steep side of a mountain. The more you slide, the faster you go down. This condition is also explained with the word light, and as far as I understand, it means a person who is against everyone and thinks everyone is against them. I won't dwell on the slow depletion of my energy. It is not appropriate to dwell too much on misfortunes. This saying is also worth remembering. One day, I found myself in a situation where I had no money left for food and clothing, and apart from occasionally earning a few pennies or an occasional coin, I became dependent on charity. I couldn't work a steady job, and thus my body became skin and bones, and my soul became just a skeleton. I was pitiful at that time, and it could be said that for my mind, which had become almost dead, I was more than skin and bones. In my imagination, I evaluated myself as isolated from the whole world because I was really deeply immersed. I remember my awakening well because it happened when I truly woke up in the middle of the night. My bed, once a pile of sawdust behind the carpentry shop where I used to work, was now a heap of barrels with an old barrel forming a pyramid underneath. It was a cold night, and I shivered, yet in my dream, I saw the exhaustion of good things with light and warmth. When I describe the impact of my dream, you might think my mind was influenced. What encouraged me to write these things was the hope that others' minds would be similarly affected. The thing that led me to believe I had two selves, no knowledge of it, is this dream, and my own good self that provided me with the help I asked for in vain from those I knew. I heard that this situation is explained with the word duality. Still, this word does not encompass my understanding. A pair cannot be anything more than a pair that does not independently belong to its halves. However, I won't engage in philosophy because philosophy is nothing more than a set of clothes to decorate a lifeless body. Also, it wasn't the dream itself that influenced me. It was the impression it created and the effect it had on me, granting me my freedom. Then I encouraged my other self. After struggling through snow and wind in my dream, I carefully looked inside a window and saw my other self there. He was shining with health, the logs in his fireplace were blazing with fire. There was a conscious power and strength in his demeanor, he was physically and mentally strong. I lightly knocked on the door, and he invited me in while there was a non-mocking smile in his eyes. He didn't say a word like welcome. I sat in a chair near the fire as he gestured, and there was a non-offensive mocking smile in his eyes. I left, burdened with the shame and discomfort of the contradiction between us being heated up. Just then, I woke up, and the strange part of my story begins here. Because when I woke up, I wasn't alone. A being, later realized to be abstract for others but real for me, was with me. The being resembled me, yet strikingly different. His eyebrows, not higher than mine, looked rounder and fuller. His eyes were clear, straight, and filled with enthusiasm and determination. His lips, chin, and all contours of his face and body were dominant and determined. He was calm, unyielding, and self-confident. I, on the other hand, was cowering. I trembled with a magical shiver, and I was afraid even of shadows that couldn't be grasped. When the being turned and left, I followed him, and throughout the day, I never lost sight of him except when he disappeared after entering some doors I dared not enter. I was especially directed towards places and people I was most afraid of, such as the offices where I once worked, and individuals involved in my financial transactions. I followed the being all day, and in the evening, I saw him disappear behind the doors of a hotel famous for his joy and good life. I looked for the pyramid of barrels and sawdust. Although I encountered him in my dream that night, which I call the good self, he was still with me when I woke up by chance from my sleep. And there was that calm, mocking smile on his face. His humiliation hurt me a lot, and the second day was no different from the first, and it was a repetition of his behavior. But again, I, with that being present, was destined to wait outside while he visited the places I wanted to go. It is fear that separates a person's soul from their body and puts them in a degrading situation. I tried to express this many times, but the words turned into incomprehensible sounds in my throat, and that day ended just like the previous one. This situation continued for days that followed each other until I stopped counting them. Still, I discovered that being constantly in contact with the being had an effect on me, and one night, I found the courage to speak despite my obvious reluctance when I woke up among the barrels and saw him there. I dared to ask, "Who are you?" and even recoiled at the firmness of my own voice. This question seemed to please my companion. So much so that when he answered, I noticed that his smile was less mocking. "I am me," he replied. "I am the person you used to be. I am the person you could be again. Why hesitate? I am who you used to be and the person you threw away for your other friend. I am the one made in the image of God that you were so proud of, the one who didn't bow to fear. I am your past, your true self. I am the one who knows your dreams, desires, and potential. You have become a mere shadow of me, but I am here to guide you back." I was taken aback, and my fear turned into a mixture of confusion and curiosity. I didn't believe this entity was real. I considered it a manifestation of my inner conflict. "You are just a figment of my imagination," I retorted. "Whether I am real or not is not the issue. What matters is that you can be me again. You have lost your way and embraced a false identity. The path you are on leads to nowhere, but I can show you the way back to yourself. I can lead you out of this darkness." His words resonated within me, and despite my skepticism, I felt a strange sense of longing. The being continued to visit me, and we engaged in conversations. He spoke about the choices I made, the compromises I accepted, and the dreams I abandoned. He reminded me of the potential I once had and how I let it slip away. Days turned into weeks, and I found myself at a crossroads. I had to make a choice between the path of fear, compromise, and emptiness, or the path of courage, authenticity, and fulfillment. The being, my true self, urged me to choose the latter. It was a difficult decision, as the path of familiarity and comfort was tempting, but deep down, I knew I couldn't continue living a life that wasn't truly mine. With a newfound determination, I chose to reconnect with my true self. It wasn't an easy journey, and there were moments of doubt and resistance, but gradually, I started to rediscover the person I once was. I mended broken relationships, pursued abandoned dreams, and embraced the potential that had long been dormant within me. The being, my guide, slowly faded away as I reclaimed my identity. The journey of self-discovery was both challenging and liberating. I learned that honesty with oneself is the first step towards living a fulfilling life. Embracing one's true self requires courage, but the rewards are immeasurable. Now, as I look back, I see that the being who accompanied me was a reflection of my inner wisdom and the embodiment of the person I could become. The dream that initially seemed like a surreal experience turned out to be a catalyst for my transformation. This story, my story, serves as a reminder that sometimes we need to confront our fears, question our choices, and rediscover our true selves. Life is a journey of self-discovery, and the path to authenticity is worth taking. But I was still condemned to wait outside during the visits the entity made to the places I wanted to go. The thing that separates a person's soul from their body and puts them in a degrading situation is fear. I tried to express this many times, but the words turned into incomprehensible sounds in my throat, and that day ended just like the previous one. This situation continued for days that followed each other until I stopped counting them. Still, I discovered that being constantly in contact with the entity had an effect on me, and one night, when I woke up among the barrels and saw it there, I found the courage to speak, even with an obvious reluctance. I dared to ask, "Who are you?" and even recoiled at the firmness of my own voice. This question seemed to please my companion. So much so that when he answered, I noticed that his smile was less mocking. "I am me," he replied. "I am the person you used to be. I am the person you could be again. Why hesitate? I am who you used to be and the person you threw away for your other friend. I am the one made in the image of God that you were so proud of, the one who didn't bow to fear. I am your past, your true self. I am the one who knows your dreams, desires, and potential. You have become a mere shadow of me, but I am here to guide you back." I was taken aback, and my fear turned into a mixture of confusion and curiosity. I didn't believe this entity was real. I considered it a manifestation of my inner conflict. "You are just a figment of my imagination," I retorted. "Whether I am real or not is not the issue. What matters is that you can be me again. You have lost your way and embraced a false identity. The path you are on leads to nowhere, but I can show you the way back to yourself. I can lead you out of this darkness." His words resonated within me, and despite my skepticism, I felt a strange sense of longing. The entity continued to visit me, and we engaged in conversations. He spoke about the choices I made, the compromises I accepted, and the dreams I abandoned. He reminded me of the potential I once had and how I let it slip away. Days turned into weeks, and I found myself at a crossroads. I had to make a choice between the path of fear, compromise, and emptiness, or the path of courage, authenticity, and fulfillment. The entity, my true self, urged me to choose the latter. It was a difficult decision, as the path of familiarity and comfort was tempting, but deep down, I knew I couldn't continue living a life that wasn't truly mine. With a newfound determination, I chose to reconnect with my true self. It wasn't an easy journey, and there were moments of doubt and resistance, but gradually, I started to rediscover the person I once was. I mended broken relationships, pursued abandoned dreams, and embraced the potential that had long been dormant within me. The entity, my guide, slowly faded away as I reclaimed my identity. The journey of self-discovery was both challenging and liberating. I learned that honesty with oneself is the first step towards living a fulfilling life. Embracing one's true self requires courage, but the rewards are immeasurable. Now, as I look back, I see that the entity who accompanied me was a reflection of my inner wisdom and the embodiment of the person I could become. The dream that initially seemed like a surreal experience turned out to be a catalyst for my transformation. This story, my story, serves as a reminder that sometimes we need to confront our fears, question our choices, and rediscover our true selves. Life is a journey of self-discovery, and the path to authenticity is worth taking. But again, if you understand that the path of negativity is tempting, this story should also be a warning. Choose wisely, and may your journey be one of fulfillment and authenticity.
Thank you for watching the video and listening to this magical story. I hope you receive the energy and message of this story accurately and that it magically enriches your life as well.